Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. I'm your host today and we're recording this reaction podcast on a Wednesday morning because we have finally had confirmation or communication on Erik ten Hag's future and confirmation that he will remain in charge at United after a period of uncertainty. I am joined on this podcast by Tyrone Marshall. We're going to get into it, give you our reaction and give some analysis on the big news that arrived on Tuesday night around 10:30 or 10:15. First of all, Tyrone, how are you?
Yes, good. Thank you, Stephen. Good. That obvious time for communicating big news at 10:15 on a Tuesday night. I think that's in all the PR manuals. That's when you should get the news out there.
You were asleep. I was winding down, but we managed to cover it nonetheless. And here we are on this podcast to actually get stuck into it properly. Ty, we've sat here for 2 weeks now and talked about it at length. We expected the decision pretty swiftly after the FA Cup final. It didn't come. We finally got it now on the 12th of June. Obviously, it arrived on the 11th of June. What's your initial reaction? It has been a surprise at how long it has taken, and United have actually give Ten Hag their backing in the end.
Yeah, I mean, surprised at how long it's taking, but not surprised at the fact he's staying. I think every day this process went on and got longer and longer, the more it pointed to the fact he was going to stay. So not surprised that he's staying, and as a result, not surprised that it's broken at such an inconvenient time, just generally, but also for newspapers and things like that. It's not been a well handled process. I know INEOS will insist that this is a thorough end of season review. They're going to do a review at the end of every season. Apparently, it's not always going to be this thorough. So presumably that means they won't try and find replacement managers at the end of every season. But it's not it's not been a good process. It's not been well handled. It's been messy. It's very obvious that Ten Hag is staying because they've not found an alternative they want. That's not the way to go about things. It feels to me very much like they have really missed the guidance of people like Omar Barada and Dan Ashworth. Maybe if United had that full structure and football structure in place now, this would have been a bit cleaner, a bit clearer. As it is, it's been a muddled process. They've clearly spoke to several managers behind Ten Hag's back. They've sounded out people to replace him. No matter how serious those talks are, it's blatantly obvious that Ten Hag wasn't the first choice for this job and has only still got it because they weren't convinced about alternatives. And like I say, I'm not surprised that's the outcome they've come to. I think it's been obvious for probably a week now. I was saying it in the office last week that it felt now like he had to stay. Really, there was no other. If they had an alternative they'd alighted on, they'd have appointed him. So I'm not surprised that it's reached the point where he's staying. But it's been a messy process, a protracted process, and I think INEOS will be keen to kind of try and put this behind them. But I think the reality is this is going to be hanging over Ten Hag and hanging over the club going into next season.
It has been a mess. It really has. I think we sat on the last podcast and said if we were recording by Friday and we still didn't have communication, that objectively it would be a farce. Thankfully, it has come a few days before then, so it's finally settled. I think fans are just relieved to finally have the end of this. It's been dragging on, and the uncertainty has helped nobody. It was affecting the transfer plans. We'll finally have a decision. Whether or not it is the right one, only time will tell. You suggested a few weeks ago, Tyrone, that if Ten Hag was to stay, that he would get a new contract because he was in the final year of his deal and he could not continue because there would just be the whole narrative would be around his future. Every result would be heavily scrutinised. So there has been confirmation that he is now in talks. He's obviously expected to sign a new deal. What are your thoughts on that? Because it probably was always inevitable. If they were going to back Ten Hag, they had to give him a contract, didn't they?
Yeah, they did, and they have to now make it look like Ten Hag is the man. They have to try and give him some power back because what has happened has clearly weakened his position. I mean, to give Ten Hag his credit, I don't think he ever lost the dressing room or had the kind of fractured dressing room that Solskjaer had to deal with, that Ranić had to deal with. I think the players have generally remained behind him, certainly as a person. I think some have got doubts about his tactics, some have got doubts about the quality of the coaching, but as a person, they've remained behind him. So it's not like it's a fractured dressing room like it has been previously, but it's still a difficult position to inherit now. They've still got to find a way forward and through all of this, and it's just it's not going to be easy. He had to get that new contract as just that statement of intent, but we all know contracts are worthless. Really, it is a statement of intent. It is a show of faith. It's a show to Ten Hag of, look, we want you to stay. But if he signs a new contract, United lose their first 8 games of next season, or 6 of their first 10, or start next season as badly as started this one, he will be sacked. And we all know that's the case now. And we all know that INEOS aren't entirely convinced about him. And, even from United could never really confirm officially that the manager was staying. With this end of season review, they've kind of put themselves in a strange position that they were never going to release a club statement saying our manager's staying because, well, yeah, that's kind of presumed in a way. Only it wasn't presumed because of this end of season review, because they'd spoken to other managers, and and even now it feels like this is a loose backing. No one at INEOS, no one at the club is saying we're keeping him because we've decided he's the best man for the job. No one is saying that. No one is saying this was a process to find the best manager for Man United, and we realise we've already got the best manager for Man United. People are saying things like he deserves a chance to show what more he can do. He deserves a chance to work under the new football structure. That's, the translation of that is show us what you can do. Show us that you're better than we've seen last season. So I equated it before on social media in a piece I'd written to kind of the dreaded vote of confidence, and it does feel like it's only maybe a level above that, really. And the challenge now is for Ten Hag to solidify his position. I mean, the obvious way through that is results, and he can only do that from August onwards. But it does feel like he needs to start the season pretty well.
I used the analogy before we came on there. It's like if you've got a girlfriend and you're in a turbulent relationship. She's going out. She might be having dinner with other men, Tyrone, right? She's going out, going to have a few, maybe an Italian or a Chinese or an Indian. She comes back and she's settled on you, but she's staying with you for the wrong reasons. And I know it's not that simplistic, and it's a very probably a funny way to look at it, but it does feel like that way with Erik ten Hag in United now. In terms of the reasons he's actually being kept, it was kind of sold to us on Tuesday night that there are multiple different factors. Obviously, winning 2 trophies in 2 seasons is a huge feather in his cap. His work with young players has been looked upon very advantageously. Obviously, Alejandro Garnacho and Kobbie Mainoo have been brilliant under Ten Hag, and they've broken to the first team, which we have given him credit for. They've also pointed to the injuries that he's dealt with. There has been an unrelenting injury crisis, and we've covered that and highlighted that throughout the season. But on the flip side, other clubs have dealt with injuries. Look at Chelsea, for example, and they finished above United and actually qualified for the Europa League. Through league position, I know they were demoted in the end because of the FA Cup success. And recruitment, the signings were sold as kind of long-term signings. Andre Onana came to the club to influence build-up play. Rasmus Højlund was young. But again, Tyrone, on the flip side, Ten Hag has spent over £400 million, and he's been the heaviest backed manager in the post Sir Alex Ferguson era. So you kind of look at all those reasons, you weigh it up, but then you look at the results last season, and they suffered some really, really poor results along the way. The performances were dreadful. The midfield, the space in the midfield, I think you described it as the size of the Grand Canyon after the podcast at Wembley, and that's so true. There are clearly massive issues for Ten Hag to fix. I think there's been one column with advantages of keeping them and another column with disadvantages. For me personally, Ty, I think the bad outweighed the good towards the end of last season, and I would have actually leaned toward getting rid of them. Do you think the right decision has been made?
It's very hard to say. I mean, that analogy that you started with, Stephen, felt an awful lot like it was being spoken from personal experience. So I hope you're okay, first of all. And yeah, it is a really difficult call, and you can have sympathy with INEOS at the difficulty of it. Like you say, there are positives and negatives in both columns. Really, the Garnacho and Mainoo especially. I mean, Garnacho was hiding in plain sight when Ten Hag arrived. Everyone knew about his talent. Mainoo, he's had a big influence on the 2 trophies. Cup final week, I feel, was huge for him. Not just the fact that they won the cup final, but I've been told that the players had the end of that week heading into that final. They had belief in a game plan more than any other time that season, as someone close to one player said, and it was almost like the rest of the season hadn't happened. They had so much faith and so much belief going into that game, and that clearly shows what Ten Hag is capable of. It was a game plan that worked brilliantly, and it wasn't like it wasn't a smash and grab. It wasn't a lucky win against City, and I think that did change things a little bit for INEOS. It showed, like I say, what he is capable of. His first season showed what he is capable of. like you say, the league season last year was disastrous. Some of those defeats were horrendous. My biggest issue was always that, and I've said this countless times on this podcast, but the tactical failings that were obvious in autumn were still there in spring. That midfield and that huge hole was there throughout almost the entire season, apart from maybe the last 3 games. And it does not reflect well on a manager when you are either incapable of fixing it or too stubborn to fix it. And that's where we were with Ten Hag. The injuries are a very fair mitigation. It's impossible to say how things would have happened without the injuries. Martinez and Shaw especially. I think those two affected Onana and United's build-up play. But the compromise he came to with those injuries, with a deep defensive line, the high press, I know we didn't take the criticism well from pundits, but they were right. It was disastrous at times. And even with the injuries, some of that is on him. I know players, some of these players have had muscle injuries this year and feel it's been caused by too much running and being overworked in training. And some of that has to be on what's happened. You can't have that amount of injuries. And that amount of injuries, not in games, but so many injuries picked up in training. It almost became a running joke that you turn up to Carrington on Friday, half an hour before the press conference starts, you'd wait for the message from the club about which player had picked up a new injury. Barely a week went by without a press conference where it was like, so-and-so picked up an injury in training on Thursday, or so-and-so's picked up an injury in training this morning. It was almost weekly. And, that's not a coincidence. In this day and age of sports science and monitoring training loads, that is not a coincidence. So yeah, there are positives and negatives. The transfers thing is going to be interesting going forward. There's been hits, certainly with Martinez. Onana got better and better, but they could have signed Onana on a free the year before. Anthony, I maintain, is probably going to go down as the worst signing in Manchester United's history, given the fee they paid for him and how far he looks from the finished article. Højlund, senior figures at United were saying they weren't going to pay more than 50, 60 million, and that the figures Atalanta were quoting were laughable. Then a week later, they signed him for 64 million, rising to 72. The same with Anthony. Ten Hag's first season, senior figures at United in July are saying, 60 million euros is not going to happen. It's ridiculous. A ridiculous fee from Ajax. In the end, they pay 100 million euros. I mean, these clubs are seeing United coming. And a lot of that is because Ten Hag is pushing for these players. And I know people like to defend his transfer record and point at John Murta and blame Murta for this, but that's really not the case. Ten Hag has had more freedom as a manager of a top club to pick and choose his transfer targets and the fees spent than any other manager at any other big club. And he has overspent on some players. And that is just a fact of it. And, you can blame John Murta if you like. No, he's no longer here, but it is not just Murta's fault. Ten Hag could easily have said, Højlund's not worth that at this stage of his career. I need some spare money to sign other players. He could have easily said, I like Anthony, but he's not a 100 million euro player. He didn't, so that is on him as much as it's on John Murta for me. But, things will change going forward with recruitment. Maybe that will help. But it was a tough decision. There are positive and negatives. There are reasons for keeping him, not least the fact that there is no standout candidate. But now they've made their decision. It still feels like pressure's on. And like I say, this is going to overshadow the first 2 months of the season, probably, because it does feel like it's going to be the elephant in the room. If they lose on the first day of the season, it's going to be the elephant in the room. It's going to dominate the agenda from August and September, probably.
I tweeted after the news had emerged, and I just said, look, the facts are United suffered a record number of defeats in the Premier League, conceded their most goals ever in a campaign, and Ten Hag oversaw a total of 19 defeats across all competitions, which was the most since 1977. Someone replied saying that was unnecessary. I can't even speak. Unnecessary negativity. And I just said, well, look, it's facts at the end of the day. That is the cold light of it. And United have not been good enough. That is just a fact. And it's also a fact, Tyrone, that the lack of alternatives has been huge in this. I mean, United contacted Kieran McKenna before the FA Cup final. Thomas Tuchel held talks with Sir Jim Ratcliffe in Monaco. We've talked about it at length, really, that there has been an uninspiring list of alternatives to Ten Hag, including Gareth Southgate, who's obviously at the Euros with England. And no matter how this is dressed up and the reasons are discussed and the factors are considered, the lack of alternatives has been a huge, huge thing in this, hasn't it? The reason Ten Hag's kept his job.
Yeah, absolutely. You delivered more facts than Rafa Benitez there, but you are right that the lack of alternatives is a major issue. I mean, if they'd appointed Kieran McKenna, I mean, you could argue it would have been exciting given the quality his Ipswich team have shown, but I mean, it's a monumental step up. Thomas Frank is one of these coaches that always looks good on the data. Clubs that are, clubs like Liverpool that look at data and analyse data. Frank always comes out highly, but Brentford had a really disappointing season. I still think out of those potential candidates, Pochettino, I think, would still be the one for me. I think he did pretty well in the second half of the season at Chelsea, but far from guaranteed. Tuchel was the one that probably had the best CV, and that if there was going to be a change, fans seemed to want to go towards. But his track record with clubs was always going to put INEOS off. His last 4 jobs, the longest he spent anywhere is 2.5 years. He doesn't hang around at places because he falls out with people. And also, I mean, I sat in 3 or 4 Tuchel press conferences last year when United played Bayern in the Champions League, and he is a brilliant talker. He spoke, in Munich when United were really struggling in September at the start of the season. He spoke better about the pressures of managing a club like United than Ten Hag did. It was really interesting stuff, really good stuff. And the same at Old Trafford. And every time you listen to him, you think he'd be a great United manager. But actually, I look at Tuchel's CV, and I don't think it's that impressive, to be honest. I mean, he won the Champions League with Chelsea. That was obviously a great achievement. Beyond that, it's like a German Cup with Dortmund, a couple of French league titles with PSG. So what? I think he reached the Champions League final with PSG, but that was the COVID year, and I don't think they had that difficult a run to the final from memory. And Bayern Munich, his first title with Bayern Munich was purely because Dortmund bottled it spectacularly on the final day. This year, I mean, he's a little bit fortunate that all the attention kind of in the rest of Europe is in Bayer Leverkusen, because finishing third in the Bundesliga, when you've just signed Harry Kane, who scored 46 goals in 45 games, I mean, that is an absolute disaster for Bayern. That is such a bad underperformance. And I don't look at Tuchel's CV and think he's as cracked up as everyone maybe claims he is. I don't see any achievements on there that make me go, wow, he's really overperformed there. Chelsea aside, when he won the Champions League, but I mean, that fell apart so quickly. But that aside, I look at everything else and I think, yeah, you probably should have done that. So I can see why INEOS wouldn't have been convinced by Tuchel, not just because of his prickly personality and that reputation for falling out with people, but I just don't think his CV is quite as garlanded as other people say it is.
I completely agree, and that's such a fair assessment. But then, surely Tuchel would have done better than 8th last season in the Premier League. It was just such a dismal campaign, wasn't it? Really, and it's interesting how you talk about Tuchel's communication, because Ten Hag was so popular in that first season because of the way he spoke. He hit all the right notes. He was critical even when United won. And he was kind of a return to what you expect a United manager to sound like. That was lost a bit last season, Ty. Maybe it was because it was the most challenging year of his career. Yeah, he's always been very successful, no matter where he's gone. And maybe that's why. Maybe that explains it. So I think next season, if they do start winning again, I think that's a big thing for supporters. They would like to hear Ten Hag starting to sound like Ten Hag again, really. He lost his kind of charisma and how he sounded in press conferences and post-match interviews. Well, that'll be it for part 1, and we'll be back in a moment for part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of the Manchester is Red podcast. Now we'll actually get into what went wrong for United last season into a bit more depth. Tyrone, how long have you got? We just bring all the other podcasts together and mould them into one. I think back to the opening game of the season against Wolves in August, and United obviously won 1-0. Quite fortunate to win that match. Andre Nana kind of clattered a Wolves player towards the end, and Wolves should have got a penalty. But you think about the problems in that game. The midfield was just it was so open. It was absolute chaos. Wolves could easily transition on United and break forward. And the amount of shots United conceded, which was a theme throughout the year, that was a huge problem. I mean, they were conceding shots at the rate of Luton Town and Sheffield United, who were obviously relegated from the Premier League. So I look at that first game of the season, it was almost like a blueprint really for what went wrong throughout the year. Those problems just kept on happening, whether that was through stubbornness, as you said in the first part, or Ten Hag being unable to actually address them. But he has to address them next season. He's been given a chance now. He's been given a lifeline. And they are major problems, tactical problems, because United look poorly coached, and it's his responsibility to solve them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if they go into next season and for the first 6 games say they're conceding 20 plus shots, we're all going to be thinking the same thing. So there is a pressure on to change things. And I've said it before, and I wrote a piece lifting the lid a little bit here, but when you've got a decision like this coming, you always plan for every eventuality in terms of the stories and having breaking stories ready and what we call in trade an obit for when a manager leaves or someone high profile leaves, and then analysis pieces. So, we kind of got stuff together for Ten Hag leaving because, let's face it, 2.5 weeks ago, that looked the most likely outcome. And the piece I'd done was basically on, I go back to last pre-season. I remember in Australia and Thailand, and then on the second tour last year, I thought it was so clear in America how he was trying to take that team forward. And I've said it before, the success he had in the first season was great, but that was not a Ten Hag team. That was a team built on a solid defence, a midfielder who filled a prominent position and had a massive influence in Casemiro, and a forward having the season of his life. And that's why United was successful in Ten Hag's first season. I don't think it was a team Ten Hag would have looked at and gone, that's a team playing in my image.
And until he adapted, Ty, they had such a poor start. They lost the opening 2 games, shocking results against Brighton and Brentford. And the way he approached those games was very naive. It was almost as if he was back in the Dutch league. It just couldn't work in the Premier League. And he wanted to sign Frankie de Jong, which really wouldn't have worked in that midfield.
No, it probably wouldn't, no. And also they wasted 12 weeks trying to sign de Jong when it was obvious from week 1 he didn't want to come. So that was another example of just bad transfer planning, really. But it was a pragmatic team in his first season, and a new coach deserves credit for being able to deliver a pragmatic team and to recover from the way the season started. So that is by no means a criticism of him. He found a pragmatic solution that got United to third, produced some great performances. I think of the Barcelona games, won them a trophy, but he was always going to try and move things forward. And those pre-season games in America, I remember thinking it was very clear how they were trying to change. The pressing was much more aggressive. They were playing a really high defensive line. Onana, once he came in for his first game, I think it was Houston, his first game, was really pushing the defence up. And you could see what he was trying to do. But I felt like he lost his way so quickly, tactically, partly because of the injuries, probably, partly because of some of the results. I think that Wolves performance was a shock to the system. And it felt by September he'd lost his way from what he wanted to do. And, I think he tried to make United more attacking and more aggressive, but he also tried to make them like his Ajax team, who just dominated games in the final third of the opposition. But even City don't do that every week in the Premier League, and United were never going to be able to do it, especially once those injuries hit. And my view was that he started out with good intentions last summer, but lost his way, and then just couldn't really find his way back. Couldn't find a solution. And I don't know whether there was a degree of thought where he thought, if I go back to pragmatism, then I'm kind of admitting defeat on how I want this team to play. But, the signs were reasonably promising in pre-season, but when the competitive action started, it just veered off course so quickly. And like I say, it was like he'd got lost in a fog almost of tactical decisions, and he'd made so many changes that he just couldn't really see through the fog. And then all the injuries to kind of get a good solution. So it'll be interesting to see this year, when everyone's fit, what he tries to do. Presumably he will still try to play the same attacking, aggressive, front foot, dominant football. And if it comes off and United start the season brilliantly, then all these conversations will be forgotten, basically. But there is a pressure to do that.
It'll be fascinating to see whether United can return to those 2022-23 levels, Ten Hag's first season in charge, because as you said, they played differently. It was a more pragmatic approach, the different style. Does he tighten things up again? Does he revert to that approach? Because that would be a backward step, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Surely
he's actually now got to progress to what he wants them to play like. More front foot, more aggressive, pressing better. But we saw that in the FA Cup final tie. All those kind of trademarks and signs of how we thought Ten Hag wanted to play this season we're seeing at Wembley, which was very promising because he had all his players available with the exception of Luke Shaw. And it was the best performance of the season, the best performance of his tenure yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, absolutely. And, the players think it was his best performance of his tenure and the best execution of a game plan in his tenure. So that is a blueprint for what they can do. They obviously didn't have that much of the ball, but you're never going to go against City and dominate the ball. But you think back to the performance at the Etihad, it was utterly lamentable. And I know, I've been critical of what Ten Hag said after that game, and I thought, you talk about not speaking as a United manager. After that game, he didn't speak as a United manager. When he talked about the fine margins, I know they lost the game 3-1 and they were leading for a long period and they were still drawing, I think, with 10 minutes to go. But they were not fine margins in that game. They were absolutely pulverised by City. And the way Ten Hag spoke after that game made it sound like the plan was to basically soak up 27 shots and to score with every single attack that you have. That was basically what he was demanding.
And
from
to
that game
score
plan.
a world-class goal
Score
as well. I mean,
worldies.
that was it was a stunning goal.
It's just not sustainable. And then you look at the plan for the cup final and you think there's a clear execution of how to score goals there. And they pulled it off and then defended really well. And you look at that performance and you think there's a future in that. I've used this analogy several times, and it's one of Sean Dyche's several annoying trademarks that gets stuck in your head. But, when I used to cover Burnley, he used to always talk about, especially at that end of the league table, you don't necessarily look at results. You look at, is there a future in performances? And probably 70% of United's performances last year you look at and you think there's no future in that. But the cup final you look at and you think there probably is a future in that. And as to what you say now, what's he going to do going forward? He can't go back to that pragmatism. It's going to be interesting to see. We know that Jason Wilcox has come in to deliver this kind of game model, this style of play that United are going to have team to under 11s or whatever. It's not going to be what made them successful in 2022, 2023, as good as that was. It was pragmatism. So it's going to have to be more front foot, more attacking football, whether that's on transitions like Ten Hag has spoken about, making the best transition team in the world, maybe. But it's going to have to be more dominant, more aggressive and easier on the eye than it was at times last season.
In terms of how they actually achieve that, Luke Shaw and Lissandro Martinez are so crucial to build a play, aren't they? Luke Shaw has been mismanaged this season. I've made that point a few times. He even admitted much himself when he was speaking to reporters after England's game against Iceland. I think the medical staff should have definitely done better with him, and he shouldn't have played in that game against Luton in February when he was removed at half time. And Lissandro Martinez, as I said, his passing is just brilliant. And also, Ty, at number 6, Casemiro's drop-off was a huge factor in the regression this season. He was outstanding, wasn't he? He generally was world class in that first year. So they need to find a player who can sit in front of that defence, protect it, break up play and pass through the lines, and then they're pressing from the front as well. So those 3 things will get them all right. You've got a promising base to build from, I think. But I think signing a really, really good defensive midfielder is key to that. And you look at the market and it's quite difficult. We were asked to pick which players we thought United should sign yesterday for a piece, and I kind of looked at the options for a number 6 and they don't exactly inspire you, really. I mean, Joshua Kimmich maybe, or João Faina from Fulham. There's a few different names, but none of them are hugely attractive.
No, I mean, I can't see Kimmich coming to United, and I'm not sure he suits the Premier League as a holding midfielder. I think he'd probably end up playing at right back, to be honest, if United signed Kimmich. And like I say, I don't see that happening for where Kimmich wants to go and for his likely salary demands. I don't see it happening. Pelini is probably a better shout. Premier League experience, looks a really good player, really good holding midfielder.
He'd be attainable as well, wouldn't he? That's the thing. You could probably get him for 30 million.
Yeah, maybe more than that, but he probably is attainable. And if United are interested in a Fulham player, that Fulham player is going to want to go. Let's be honest. So it feels like one that would be doable. The problem for United is that they just, they haven't got a big budget this summer. It's in terms of cash they can spend now, it's probably less than 50 million, and they've got to boost it by sales. And they don't just need a holding midfielder; they need a striker and they need a defensive midfielder as well. And fitting all 3 of those in is not easy. And like you say, we were asked to do that piece yesterday. And I mean, I chose mine just to be different, basically, because someone had already gone with Brantwaite. And to be honest, I'm not sure he's the answer either, for the reasons I outlined last week at centre back. But they need a striker as well. They can't go into next season with just Højlund because it's too much pressure on him, and they just need options. So, and like you, I looked at the options at striker and I just thought there's not anything stand out here. I mean, in the end, I went for Youssef En-Nesyri just because he's going to leave Sevilla. He's not going to sign a new contract there next summer. He's available fairly cheaply. I think he's got a good profile for the Premier League, and it'd be a reasonable signing in terms of fee. But there's not there doesn't look to be standout options for a lot of these positions. But if they get someone to help Hoyland out, if they get a good quality holding midfielder, if they get another centre half, and everyone stays fit, then, well, I mean, there's the groundwork there for next season, and also it removes those. I mean, it removes those excuses essentially. Like I say, I think some of the excuses are fair, and the injury excuse is fair, but it removes them if everyone's fit and you sign players in those three key positions. Then there's no reason you can't hit the ground running at the start of the season.
They're going to have to be clever in the market. There's no doubt about that. And
Yeah.
it kind of makes you look back at the money that they've spent in the last 2 summers and the position they're in now. And it does add a sense of regret to certain signings. Cough Anthony for £86 million. When you're wasting money on a player like that, and then you're in the position that you are now, you look back and think, why did we invest that much? And even a player like Mason Mount, I still believe and I hope he should come good. But very, very disappointing first season, blighted with injury concerns. 55 million from Chelsea when he could have been signed for free this summer. He was in the final year of his deal. That was objectively a bad decision with the benefit of hindsight. In terms of the actual impact on transfers from this news, Ty, the football structure has been changed since Sir Jim Ratcliffe's investment has been signed off officially in February. Obviously, Will Cox has come in as technical director. Newcastle is still in negotiations with United with Dan Ashworth. That episode has got quite, I think it's fair to say, a bit messy with Dan Ashworth, but he should come in sooner rather than later, you'd hope. And Omar Barada has come in as CEO. So the transfer and recruitment strategy is being changed, and it will be changed for this summer. It will be different to how United have operated in previous windows. We discussed before coming on air in our meeting with our editor how Ten Hag, when he was appointed in the Dutch newspaper, said that control was a non-negotiable for him over transfers. He needed an element of control in the transfer market. But now with these changes, we understand he's going to be aligned with the new structure and how they want to operate, which means he will have less control. That'll be fascinating going forward, won't it? Because it's a different way of working for Erik ten Hag at United.
Yeah, it is. I mean, he did have kind of a similar-ish way at Ajax, I guess. He had a very strong relationship with Mark Overmars. Too strong now. It's clearly clouding his judgment when it comes to defending Overmars in interviews with Dutch papers. I mean, that is not a good look. He needs to knock that on the head, I think it's fair to say, in public. But yeah, things are going to change. I mean, Jason Wilcox is the man running this window with Ashworth still unavailable. I mean, Dan Ashworth's garden's going to be in the National Trust when this finally gets sorted out. It's absolutely incredible how long it's taken. And I think United have missed Ashworth and Barada in this process. But things are going to change recruitment-wise. I mean, Ten Hag has a veto over transfers at the moment. Whether that will continue, we will see. I think that's probably going to be an interesting detail in his new contract. And like I say, you only have to look at the last 2 windows to realise that it's a recruitment strategy entirely driven by Ten Hag. John Murtough was basically doing the negotiations, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. The way United used to do it was that the manager would say he wants a position, so let's say right winger, and the recruitment team would draw up a list of 5 potential players, and then the manager would get the say on which one it was. It just so happened that there was a former Ten Hag player or a player with the same agency, with SEG as the agent, on every single list, it seemed. So when they wanted a right winger, Anthony was on that list of 5 and Ten Hag wanted him. When they wanted a left centre-back, Martinez was on that list of 5 and Ten Hag wanted him. And on that occasion, he was right because the recruitment department wanted Pau Torres. So he was right there. But you only have to look at the number of ex-players he's signed, the number of players connected to SEG he's signed. His fingerprints are all over this transfer strategy, for better occasionally or more often for worse. And it is going to be fascinating to see how that changes, because I think it's got to change. And you even look at something like Sofian Amrabat. I mean, that was a deal entirely dominated and pulled by Ten Hag, to the point that he used to work with Amrabat, and Amrabat then signed up with SEG. And as much as Amrabat contributed in the final weeks of the season, I don't think anyone really thinks he's at the level of a United player. So,
well, all signings have kind of fit into one billing, haven't they, with Ten Hag? They've played in the Eredivisie.
Yeah.
They're Dutch. They've previously worked with them before, and it's just not worked. You need to move on from that, because given Ten Hag such influence, all managers and coaches should be given a say. We're not saying that, but we've said this time and time again in this podcast. You have to buy players for the club instead of the manager, because when the manager gets sacked, inevitably you're left with a squad that's just a mismatch and it's just an absolute mess, and there's no continuity. So going forward, that has to be a positive, that there is this new structure, because Ten Hag's recruitment tide hasn't been good. It's just a fact. Again, facts.
Yeah, it hasn't been good. I mean, there are, it's not a total disaster, I don't think. Martinez, I maintain still, is going to be a quality signing. Onana got better as last season went on, I think. Still not entirely got rid of all the concerns, but I think he generally looks a decent signing. Højlund has got loads of potential. United probably overpaid for where he was at that stage of his career.
It's just the money on. I completely agree with that. It's just the money on Anthony and Mason Mount. That's the massive form, particularly Anthony, more than Mason Mount. I mean, argue. That does not reflect well.
No, the Anthony one is clearly disastrous. I mean, he was just overpriced, wasn't he? Mount, Chelsea got the better end of that deal, but I don't think it was as easy as saying you wait and sign him on a free, because I don't think he'd have stayed at Chelsea to be signed on a free, basically. I think the Onana one is probably more a fairer criticism, although even then he was quite far down the line. I think we're going to Inter Milan when Ten Hag got the United job. But, Mount, they certainly overpaid at 55 million. I think they started off at 35, 40, and Chelsea wanted 60 and very nearly got 60 in the end. So yeah, I think they probably did overpay for players, and recruitment's got to get better. I think it's pretty clear that Ratcliffe has emphasised that recruitment has to get better. They have to be, he's called them the dumb money in the market before, and there's no doubt that's the case. And to give him his due, Ratcliffe saw what was coming with Casemiro. I mean, Ratcliffe raised the Casemiro signing as a potential issue during meetings in Ten Hag's first season, when Casemiro was the flavour of the month. Everyone thought Casemiro was the best thing since sliced bread at that point. But Ratcliffe, with his business head on, could see that a 4-year deal with an option on a player signed for 70 million at that age was not good business sense, basically, and so it has proven. So I think it's pretty clear that under INEOS, although the start they've had with this decision has not been at all convincing, they've still got a lot of goodwill with the fans, and I think it's clear that getting better value in the transfer market is going to be a major thing for them going forward.
You have to give new owners the benefit of the doubt, don't you? I think this kind of whole process around Ten Hag has been a mess. It just has been, but they will be given the benefit of the doubt, and I think rightly so. There's been some promising signs and all the right things have been said that won't particularly be marred by the last few weeks, and it can only be positive going forward, you would hope. We'll leave it there for part 2, and we'll be back in a moment for part 3. We'll look ahead to next season now as Tyrone is blowing his nose. Are you all right, Ty? You look a little bit under the weather. Is it hay fever?
Maybe a bit of hay fever. There's some sunshine in Manchester, and it must be at least 15 degrees. So maybe it's a bit of hay fever.
I was on the golf course last night. I was struggling, but I'm sure people don't want to listen to us rumble on about hay fever concerns. They want to hear about the football, and there will be enormous pressure on Ten Hag Ty next season. That's just a fact. A running theme of this podcast. A lot of facts. Look, if United come out and struggle in the first few months, I mean, the whole narrative is going to be around the meeting with managers earlier in the year, the uncertainty around his role, that United considered sacking him. That's inevitably going to come into play. So it's really imperative that they make a strong start, because if they don't, there are going to be questions again. And even with that contract, as you said, it doesn't really mean anything. It is a statement from the club, but they had to do it, didn't they? It was inevitable.
Yeah, they did. And, I think Ten Hag is going to watch the Euros this summer and really hope that England flop, because if they don't, then the spectre of Southgate over him at the start of the season is going to be huge. And, I know a lot of fans don't want to hear it, but he really is a candidate for this job if it becomes available anytime soon. And if we have the scenario where England have a really good Euros, if they win it or reach the final and Southgate leaves, then, like I say, it's going to dominate the agenda at the start of the season, and it makes it easier for INEOS if they want to make a change. If we get to October and it's pretty clear that, the mitigation presented by Ten Hag was not, or nothing has changed, essentially. If we get to October and the issues are still there, the underperformance is still there, the tactical problems are still there, and if Southgate's suddenly available with his stock risen since the Euros, that's going to be a major problem for Ten Hag. And it does, I think it only increases the possibility of Southgate being the next United manager. That is dependent on the Euros. If England bomb, if England go out in the groups or go out in the last 16 or even the quarterfinals, it becomes a much more difficult appointment, but he has, I've written a piece kind of analysing the decision this morning, and I think it's pretty clear he has to start the season really, really well, because he is still on trial, and you could argue every manager is on trial, but I mean, they're not. Guardiola wasn't on trial. Klopp wasn't on trial. There's plenty of managers started this season. Arteta is not on trial. Others, you could say, yeah, okay, I get the point that if you have a bad run of results, things can change quickly. But Ten Hag is starting from a position of being under pressure because of what happened last season, and he's starting from a position of knowing that his managers have tried to get a replacement. They tried to get a replacement for the cup final. They tried to get a replacement after the cup final. So, his position is still weak. Whether he signs a new contract or not, his position as manager is weak, and the only way he can strengthen it is by delivering results. And if the season starts really well, then fair enough. All of this will be forgotten. Essentially, his position will back to being strong, and he'll feel pretty solid. But if the season starts poorly, then there's going to be pressure on straight away. And I'm not sure necessarily he'll get that long to turn things around, because we know INEOS aren't convinced by him. What's happened over the last 2 weeks wouldn't have happened if INEOS were totally convinced they had the right man for the job.
We'll go back to Rich Fay's theory, which we mentioned, was it last week or earlier on this week? I can't remember. It's all blended into one. But look, Gareth Southgate manages at the Euros. United give Ten Hag their backing. If it goes well and Ten Hag gets good results, and brilliant, you crack on. But if he struggles and the results are poor, then he gets sacked and Southgate becomes available. His contract with England obviously ends toward the end of the year. That would be the nightmare scenario, I think, for United fans. I think no matter which way they kind of were thinking about Erik Ten Hag, whether they wanted him to be sacked or to be backed, I think they can all agree that they did not want Gareth Southgate. And I saw a bit of that on social media as well. In terms of what the squad could look like then, Tyrone, what needs to be done? We've saw a few departures confirmed already, Varane, Martial, some of the deadwood getting cleared out. And I think getting the best out of Marcus Rashford, it always seems like the kind of remit for a manager. A new manager, when they come into the club, they say, all right, can you get the best out of Rashford? He goes on a great run of form and then kind of regresses again. But that is a huge, huge thing for next season. Rashford needs to get back to his best, and Ten Hag needs to help him to do that.
Yeah, or alternatively, he makes the ruthless decision and says, you've had countless chances, you're off, basically.
Very good point. Could you see that happening?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, I don't think it's impossible by any stretch of the imagination, especially if United got a decent offer. But, I think it's unlikely. I mean, I'd be very surprised if Rashford wasn't with United still at the start of the season. But I think there's certainly an argument that he's had enough chances at United and that he keeps blowing them. So he'd be slightly fortunate, I think, to get another season. He underperformed massively this year, and not only that, it's just it's off the pitch misstep after off the pitch misstep at the moment. So I can see a strong manager, and the issue is if you get rid of him, you need another attacking player in that position, so you need good money for him. And I'm not sure there's a club out there that would pay good money for him. So I think that is probably as big a reason as any why he stays there. If he does stay, he needs to get the best out of him for sure.
And to be fair, I've said Ten Hag needs to help Rashford to do that. Rashford needs to help himself, doesn't he? You've just mentioned the kind of off-field antics and his behaviour, his kind of trip to Dublin and doing Jägermeisters like me and you do after work on a Friday. You can't act like that if you represent United, can you? You need to behave better to return to those levels. It's on him at the end of the day.
Yeah, massively. And some of his behaviour this year has been poor. The party after the City game, the Belfast trip, the lateness for the team meeting last year. There's a string of issues that have happened here on Ten Hag's watch that would have cost a lesser player his place at the club. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And Rashford is only still there because he's Rashford, because he's academy graduate, because he's delivered in the past. And we talk about Ten Hag helping him. I mean, Ten Hag gave him the platform to have the season of his life 2 years ago now when he scored 30 goals. And I remember at the end of that season, Ten Hag saying in a press conference, now's the challenge to get 40. He's good enough to get 40. And I mean, did he even reach 10 last season? I'm not sure he did he, in the end? It's,
I can't remember how many it was then.
The regression was drastic and huge. And yeah, I think, Ten Hag does need to get the best out of him, but I wouldn't necessarily pin it on Ten Hag if we start next season and Rashford is still poor, because at the end of the day, Rashford has got to get the best out of himself. He's had plenty of managers now at United to get the best out of him, and he's thrived under some of them, and then those very same managers he's flopped the following year. So yes, it would boost Ten Hag if he could get Rashford back to those first season levels. But I think the ultimate responsibility for Marcus Rashford's performance at the moment is on Marcus Rashford.
That's completely fair. I think I probably set up that question a little bit harshly on Ten Hag, and it was 8 goals for Rashford last season, 8 goals and 5 assists, and that's in all competitions. It was just 7 in the Premier League. It was just another really poor year after scoring 30 goals, his best season of his career. You just see that so often, don't you? It's very up and down, and hopefully it'll be an up season next year, because it seems to be a pattern of Rashford, doesn't it? Where he can perform brilliantly one year and fall off the next. The injury crisis, we've discussed it at length. There has been some personnel changes. Gary O'Driscoll came into the club from Arsenal. A new head of physio is coming in as well. The old one has been sacked in February. That is so key, isn't it? I mean, we talk about transfers, tactics, personnel, but it really doesn't matter if you don't have your best players on the pitch. And at the end of the day as well, Ty, I mean, Ten Hag hasn't been blameless in this. He didn't bring his own fitness coach with him from Ajax. Obviously, his fitness coach is at the club. I must stress that. But there has been concerns of the intensity of his training sessions, and the number of muscle injuries that have been sustained suggests that it's actually something going wrong in training as opposed to matches.
Yeah, definitely. You know, as I said before, that the number of muscle injuries in training last year was astronomical, especially when you consider the second half of the season. United didn't really have that many assignments. I mean, they were out of Europe by Christmas. They were out of the Carabao Cup by Christmas. This was not a demanding schedule, yet players were picking up muscle injuries every single week in training. So, you know, there is a review into that. There's a review into everything at the moment, it seems, but that has got to change. And United cannot afford a season like last year. Like I say, they weren't the only club last year. It seemed a strange season for injuries. I mean, Newcastle suffered terribly. Chelsea suffered terribly. Other clubs at times had their moments where they had so many first-team players unavailable. And it is fair enough to raise it as mitigation, but like I say, I don't feel like the club are entirely blameless or Ten Hag is entirely blameless here, and things have got to change in that regard, because some of those players, again, Martinez and Shaw are the main ones for me. Some of those players were such big misses that they really would have made a difference during the season.
But I mean, those quotes from Luke Shaw, and I kind of alluded to them, they're just so damning. To say that in hindsight, he shouldn't have played, the medical staff shouldn't have given permission, and that everyone would agree that he shouldn't have featured. That's just for a Premier League football club, and that's just the basic stuff, isn't it? Really, I actually flagged in a piece, when you look at his season and you look how he's been handled since he's come back. For a player to have a record of muscle injuries, you surely have to consider that and treat him accordingly. And when he's come back from an injury, he's been playing 3 games in a week or 2 games in quick succession, and then his body's been breaking down again. Surely that's common sense that you can't do that with a player who has a record of muscle injuries.
You would think so, and even the week that he got injured was strange, because I think he played against Villa, came off at half time, and then played again against Luton. Didn't train, played against Luton, and came off just before half time.
Boggles the mind, doesn't it?
Yeah, so just such a strange decision, and we saw it with Martinez earlier this year. I know Ten Hag denied it, but you know he picked up that injury against. I think he picked it up against Arsenal and then played on for a few more weeks, didn't he? And played against Bayern, and clearly aggravated it. And that's just poor management of injuries. There's no doubt about it. You look at Maguire now, and we don't exactly know the issue there. But when he picked up that calf injury at the start of May, we were told 3 weeks, he's a chance of being fit for the cup final. Now he's not even fit for the Euros. I mean, that's 3 weeks. That's from 3 weeks to 2 months. That's such a big difference in terms of how serious are these injuries. It does suggest, and there is evidence, that players have been played too long, basically. The players have played through injuries or played too often when they weren't at full fitness, and that's caused some of these problems.
Lastly then, Ty, I think it is worth mentioning, as we probably did in the first part, that the players have stuck by him throughout all of this. Results haven't been good enough. We've kind of got into it at length of this podcast again. But it's never really felt like the players have turned on him, and that's been the difference. I think I suggested to Samuel one that the only glimmer of that was the Sellers Park game when they got hammered 4-0, because that was just another level of not good enough, that was. But in general, the performances have been spirited. They've kept on fighting, they've kept on running, they haven't down tools. We saw that under Solskjaer, we saw that under Mourinho. So it's happened under different managers, but it hasn't happened under Ten Hag, and that can only bode well for next season.
Yeah, it can. Like I say, I think the players, I wouldn't say kept faith with him, but they kept playing for him generally. They clearly played for him in the cup final. Like I say, that the players were impressed by his work in that week of the cup final. I think that A, that says a lot, and B, it's probably a good footing to go into next season on, that you can kind of use that as the platform for next season. You can forget everything that's happened previously, the debacle at Sellers Park. I mean, it was noticeable after that game that Ten Hag kind of changed his tune again. It was noticeable at the start of last season that he changed his messages. His first season, when they had those shocking results, he would criticise the players post-match, and you'd always hear, the players haven't followed the plan, we haven't followed the plan, that sort of thing. And players got annoyed with that. They got fed up with that. Ten Hag took it on board, and for most of last season, he didn't really criticise them. And then after that Palace game, it kind of felt like he was going back to criticising them, and rightly so after that performance. But the cup final does kind of offer everyone a fresh start. I guess it offers everyone a template for going forward, and I think that will probably count for something going into pre-season.
Early prediction for next season, then. I mean, it's an interesting question to ask without any signings being made. But look, we'll do it anyways. Pin your colours to the mast.
I just find it so hard. I mean, to be honest, I still think in my head that Ten Hag has got a huge challenge on to last till Christmas. I'll be honest. That I think that is the first staging post. I think he is still, even if he signs a new contract, he is still vulnerable here. He is still vulnerable in this position. He's not out of danger. And I think his first target has to be get to Christmas, because I do think there's a danger this dominates the start of the season. And let's be honest, the start of the season conditions what happens going forward. If after 10 league games, United are second or third, then you crack on, go forward. You've made the right decision. If after 10 games, United are sixth or seventh or worse, then we all know what's going to happen. It just feels inevitable. So I think I find it impossible to call what will happen to them next season, and I think Ten Hag's first target simply should be get to Christmas.
I'll say his target, I completely agree with that, but I'll say his target should be getting top 4. I think this season is almost like his first, really, because he's operating under that new football structure now, isn't he? After 2 years of being in that environment. But he needs to fix the issues, and if within the first few games it's declared those issues haven't been fixed, questions will be asked, and you wouldn't be surprised to see him sacked by the winter, would you? I think that's the way it could go. Hopefully not, but we will see. Thank you very much, Tyrone. Thanks for your time.
No problem. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks to listeners as well. We'll be back maybe later in the week, or if not, after the weekend. Take care.